Now, let's start with the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp. His position is being called into question after MPs say he made significant errors of judgment by acting as a go-between for an £800,000 loan for Boris Johnson.
A damning cross-party committee report found Mr Sharp failed to declare to MPs his role in facilitating the loan when he was applying for the job of BBC chairman in January 2021.
Well, let's get the thoughts of Director of Orthodox Conservatives Joseph Robertson, who's here. Good morning to you.
Morning.
What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think it's less of a story about Mr Sharp and more of a story about Mr Johnson. I think that's what the steering committee are going to be looking towards post-report. I think certainly there's already been some comments from Lib Dem MPs sort of saying that Johnson should now face the music, and I think that's where the trajectory is going to head after this report. I think that what Mr Sharp did was perhaps more transparent than perhaps the report suggests, because he did after all go to the Cabinet Secretary with what he had done, and he was told that was the end of the matter.
But that was after he was appointed as BBC chairman.
Yeah, well, he told the Cabinet Secretary quite early on, but then didn't reveal it during the interview process afterwards. So the kind of crux of this is whether or not he was being deliberately hiding this during sort of the interview process. But he can argue that he said he had already said it to the Cabinet Secretary, and in his eyes the case was closed. Whether or not that's true, we can't determine, I don't think.
I mean, he says he regrets not telling MPs about his involvement with Mr Blythe, and there's apologised. A spokesman has come out and said, is that enough? Should we just let him get on with the job now?
Well, I think this is reflective, perhaps, of the lack of trust that the public already has, and I think this, is an institution, isn't it, the BBC? So when politicians are, even the politicians don't have hold of the facts, the public's going to be even more suspicious than they are normally. So I certainly think he needs to issue a public statement on this and perhaps do something with the BBC as a whole. Why
do you think Boris Johnson is in more trouble over this than Mr Sharp?
Not necessarily more trouble, but certainly more political trouble. Because obviously this doesn't reflect well on him in terms of, whether or not he was rewarding a favour, as it were. Now, I don't think that's technically the case, because Mr Blythe, the businessman who actually received the loan from, is, of course, a distant relative of Mr Johnson. And I believe the instruction could have been made through family members. That's certainly what was being suggested. And the reason that Mr Blythe gave, of course, for this was that he didn't want to disturb Johnson during the pandemic and everything that was going on, and wanted to approach him directly through someone who had access to cabinet. So the story kind of adds up. It's a strange one, but I think what Johnson's political opponents will do is target this as further evidence of the corruption and link it to Partygate and all these other things that were happening at the time.
Maybe it raises the question of how the BBC chairman is appointed currently by the government. Possibly we should move away from that.
Absolutely, and I think perhaps there needs to be more transparency in that process. Of course, like I mentioned, this was already common knowledge to the Cabinet Secretary, and it seems a little strange that it was then never, passed along the ranks to MPs at all. They didn't have any knowledge of this, even though, the Cabinet had issued a statement saying that there should be no further financial engagement between Johnson and Mr Sharp.
I mean, the problem is with all of this, because there may well be people watching and listening saying, well, this is all terribly wrong, and there may be people, you have to let us know, perhaps saying, well, what is all the fuss about? The problem is, it almost doesn't matter now if there was actually no wrongdoing, does it? Because it's the smell of it, it's the way that, and I say this every week, when it comes to the government now, there is blood in the water.
Yeah, and I think that's the trajectory of what I've been seeing, certainly, as I mentioned, particularly from the Lib Dems, and I think Labour will jump on this at some point. It's a chance to go for the jugular. Johnson's still high profile within the party and, has massive, support within the membership. So I think this is an opportunity to really crush the credibility of the party and sort of prevent resurgence.